Hello. This is Arjun and Saurav, both doctoral students in the Department of English. And this particular session is devoted to discussion of biopolitics. So we'll start with the point Saurav has made in the arguments he has sent us, that biopolitics can be viewed also as a health paradigm now increasingly, which is done at the level of the collective population. And biological matter is being controlled through exercises of biopower, which is basically a Foucauldian paradigm. Shara, would you like to go first on questions of biopower and collective populations, and then Arjun can respond.
So what I was thinking at the level of when we talk about biopolitics, uh, because I think I mentioned this to a couple of Arjun also, I think some days back, that is it the only paradigm we can think of, because the surveillance the idea of surveillance using biological matter as a key medium by any authoritarian government is one that we can come to. It's a common ground that we can all agree upon. But then, are there different ways of examining or understanding how biological matter and its interaction with us as a collective population works? Because when I was writing the notes, I almost felt like an anti, like, when in COVID times there were this group of people called anti-vaxxers, right? They would not trust the government at all, right? Because they would say that through these injections, the government would try to at some level try to inspect us and stuff like that. So I was thinking, is there any other way? Because when we talk about biopolitics and biopower and all these ways, like the first example that came to my mind was this. I think it happened in Oregon only with Sheila Anand, right? Where she contaminated a town's whole water sewage system using that was his first of its kind of a biological attack, right? So these, I think that this was some of my opening argument thoughts, like whether there is there only one way to think about, outside the surveillance paradigm, can we think about this question?
Yeah, that's a good takeoff point actually, because why do we have to assume biopower is exclusively surveillance or biopolitics is surveillance? There is also the welfarist paradigm, where, for instance, when you think in terms of statistical data about, say, unemployment or nutrition levels, that are then subject to scrutiny, analytical purposes, and then policy measures are put in place. But I'll hand this now over to Arjun. Arjun, response to Saurav.
It is a very interesting point to start with, because I remember our having this discussion, and I also thought, because there was this piece Agamben was writing during the pandemic, and we were all wondering, I mean, is this guy like out of his senses? Because he used to think rationally, but now he's talking against administering some foreign chemical into your body, some foreign body into your body. So, like if you look at the history of the idea of power, governmentality, or biopolitics and biopower as such, like Foucault only has done a literature review and argued in his essay, Governmentality, that earlier the sovereign or the state used to only consider the principality and not the population. It actually follows the idea of the pastoral power, that how the church would take care of its its subjects. Similarly, it draws from the idea of the pastoral power, that you would have a knowledge of your citizen so that you can make policies better. So power in this case is not something that is necessarily restricting, as you said. It is definitely welfare also. But the thing is, the line that demarcates these two are very, what you say, blurred. So you do not know where surveillance start, and you do not know where the constructive forms of power come, because the notion of surveillance or the notion of grooming a population inevitably leads to the individualization and totalization of subjects, because you would make new subjectivities, you would inevitably lead to the creation of new discourses, where people would inevitably start believing or interiorizing these discourses and start to think that this is their subject status. So it's not necessarily something that is repressive as opposed to the objective means of the state that we are so used to. it is much more complicated. It also exists as a relation between individuals within the state, not necessarily something that flows from the top to bottom, but also within the individuals of the state. I think I'll leave it here.
Yeah, that's interesting because also it is partially the responsibility of the individuals. As we remember during the pandemic, we were urged to be responsible citizens. And Lisa Dietrich actually has this blog post on disregarding the health of others. So, Shaura mentioned the anti vaxxers, but there were people who absolutely refused to wear masks. And she was speaking about the fact that my autonomy trumps everything else. I really don't care if I am the cause of somebody else's health problems because I will not wear a mask. That's it. So disregarding, so there is also a sense of collective responsibility that comes into the picture when we speak about biopower and biopolitics, because it's something we have internalized. And what you said, both individualization and totalization occurring, shall we say, more or less on the same plane. But it also hinges on questions where our citizenship itself is defined in these terms. What Petrina refers to as biological citizenship. And Shaura has something to say on that. Shaura, over to you.
Sorry. Yeah, I'll come to the biological citizenship part a bit later. But what I found interesting when I was making my notes is that the idea that when you signify a population from a subjective position, and this is done by the quote unquote authorities, right? You know, the idea of the gaze, and in its bid to kind of collectivize and uniformize a varied population of different color, gender, and whatnot. So there's a gaze that is unintentionally created by the subjectivity of the authorities as such. So and this is interesting because this is ironic, because when we talk about the questions of power and biopolitics, the first one that we say is that the individual subjectivity is taken out, right? And any human being becomes a number, or what to say, a constituent part of a larger collective. So but in doing that, the state then creates a subjectivity through which it looks at its own population. So in other words, the state others its own constituent beings, right? So that is an ironic move that I think that is very interesting to think about first, because as sir just mentioned, that individualization and collectivization is also, like, it seems like we are going on the total, like a round and round thing, right? Because like too much individualization and too much collectivization almost feels like both ends of the same coin. So I was thinking about this part, like, when, especially in terms of times of something like the pandemic, how does these questions of subjectivity can be used to frame a collective as such? That can, and because subjectivity is a word which is generally used in a very, very personal point of view, that my subjectivity is bigger than the others. But then through the creation of the subjectivity by the state itself, it starts to otherize the very constitution that builds it, the population. Right. So the state becomes a body, a unique body that distances itself from its population.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point, because also, although it is distanced itself, it still remains in overall control. It's distanced, and yet part of it. So, like, we are part of the body politic of the nation, and the governance of the body politic is assigned to the state, which is where I think people like Agamben have a problem with vaccination and drug trials being part of state policy. The state is far too intrusive. Nicholas Rose's work also points in that direction. But it is also interesting to note that the state comes into the picture by also defining the borders of identities, communities, collectives, individuals. And Arjun has something to say about border politics here. Over to you, Arjun.
No, so I'd written in my notes about the sovereignty of the state, because the state can only work if there are boundaries in place. You have to other what is not part of the state to create an identity as such. So when we conceive of this sovereign space, we conceive of it as something autonomous, which is largely homogeneous, which has larger aspirations that are also coterminous in nature. We consider everything foreign as something that has the potential to contaminate this unity, this homogeneity. And this is ironically true of our bodies as well. Our body is also treated as something that has strict boundaries, has a strict autonomy, has a strict sovereign space. But we know what happened when during the pandemic, our bodies were not sovereign, our bodies were not autonomous. It was the case with our boundaries of the state as well. Most of the times, the contamination happened within the state, even without knowing that it was coming from outside. When we kept our boundaries so tight, we always had virus inside. So when they were blaming Wuhan and China for the pandemic, I remember 8 or 10 months later, they found in the sewage in Italy and Europe larger number of viruses from the sewage. They had a test run of the sewage water there and figured out the virus was already there even before it became a pandemic. It was already there. So this goes to the idea about, are we actually following these borders as a conceptual idea, or is it the case that it actually it has some bearing in reality? That do we live in enclosed bounded spaces which are not assailed by anything from outside? I do not think that is the case here.
That is really untenable, isn't it? That when you think in terms of bounded, hermetically sealed, protected spaces, by virtue of the fact that you have a body means you are exposed to the world, because bodies are bodies in the world. There is no way of assuming a body which is not a body in the world. Yeah, Arjun, you have something to say. Arjun, you had your hand up. Okay, no, what I was thinking of was the point you made, and the assumption that bodies are autonomous and self-contained is a ridiculous assumption, because bodies are bodies in the world. And by virtue of the fact that you have a skin, the skin is the largest interface that you have with the world, and there's enormous potential for any of the border points to be breached. And it's interesting you bring up the examples, because I think they discovered the bacterial and viral presence in the water resources in England. And they didn't know quite where it came from. But I also think that biopolitics relies on this, the stories of origins, where it came from. And you will remember that the anger against China transmuted itself into anger towards Chinese people, almost as though the Chinese were responsible for the parasite becoming a pandemic. And that is where I think the biopolitical paradigm becomes really dangerous, because you have moved from surveillance of populations to surveillance of a bacterial or viral form, and then turned it right back into surveillance of population for entirely different reasons. But Shauro might have something to say on this. Shauro?
I was actually thinking on the lines of both of what you and Arjun was talking about. Arjun brought up the example of Wuhan. So I was thinking, because how biopolitics also can work, I was thinking one level is that, with the cultural aspect of it, right? When I think when it was widely that the virus came from a particular region in a far east country, the whole eating practices, the cultural practice of eating different kinds of meat came into the limelight, right? And there was these people were branded as being a bad kind of people who eat bad kind of meat, right? So they are responsible for this, right? And this is funny, because this almost makes you feel that because this is where, and we have still not, I think we have still not removed ourselves from the colonialist angle also. And I mean, sir would like surely know, like, when how in the romantic time, for example, the Far East was constructed as this land of mystical yet dangerous place. I mean, for example, how like India was called, right? So, and even within the country, I don't know if I should address this, but different communities but targeted, like, like having this kind of food, that kind of food. So the fact that human health can be a way also in how questions of superiority or colonial, not, I would say neocolonialism, because for example, the same virus as Arjun pointed out, when it was found in Italy, or the same virus which was found in Sir pointed out in England, the new news came out. It was considered just a normal occurrence, right? That the virus could be anywhere. But the questions of identity being targeted, and particular people being persecuted for the same of 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 a virus circulating around the whole world is also something fantastical, that we still cannot remove ourselves from this line of thought of. So yeah.
Yeah, that's really very good and very interesting, because the fear of the virus becomes the fear of the stranger. That your virophobia is actually translated into a xenophobia. Just because people eat a different kind of diet makes them enemies. The othering process that Shara was referring to. And at some point in your notes, Arjun, you mentioned the fact that the creation of fault lines of identity markers eventually leading to surveillance, and then of course to genocides, and you can see that trajectory happening, right? So biopolitics will begin at one end, but their concrete realization, if you want to call it that, would be genocidal. But I was thinking that somewhere in between is the point that Sharo made about xenophobia, where dietary practices become supposedly very clear boundaries between us and them. And oh, you eat this, you are of a certain type of person, etc. Also, the attribution of moral values to people who eat certain kinds of food and those who don't, right? But Arjun, would you like to say something about the progression of biopolitics towards genocide?
No, it is interesting. That's why when we talk about welfare means, when we talk about biopolitics as something that grooms the population, it has a trajectory that can have a logic that eventually leads to genocide. I think Foucault only makes the point every regime, be it totalitarian, be it dictatorial, be it democratic, all the regimes have a similar rationale. The end of it is a genocidal state. So he says that the state or the Nazi state or the National Socialism state is not any different from the current modern democracy we have, because the organizing structure of it or the rationale of it remains the same. It has the potential to further jump gradations and reach there. So here, I think when we start from the point that Saurav made, the gaze of the state as something sitting there, a center trying to other people at the same time abstract an idea of it, where individuality is flattened at the same time through which you are making a discourse that grants them subjectivity. So you have flattened their individuality, you have created a set of knowledge which they later individualize to create certain identity markers. So you take census, you have idea of their caste, class, creed, religion, gender, sexuality, everything, on the basis of which you are making certain parameters. And this eventually, so here the health paradigms also come in. Now we are taking account of DNAs and looking at what population can be susceptible to certain diseases, illnesses, disorders, and all that. And we are trying to annihilate them even before they get expressed in the gene pool. So this sets a certain identity marker, creates a certain knowledge system through which certain subjectivities are individualized by these people. So when such a crisis happens, these fault lines between these identity markers are expressed. They get highlighted. So it is not the case that we are just afraid of strangers from outside, but we are afraid of strangers within. So the body becomes contaminated. The family treats the body as a contaminated one, which has the potential to further blemish them or breach their barrier. Then the family in the community becomes one. Then the community as such. Then the state as such. So then larger national borders. So isolation happens in this place with the prospect of containing it, but the logical progression is that the isolation or the treatment of bodies can lead to further subjugation. I do not think it is much different or much distinct from the state of siege we have. So when we declare emergency, at this time of pandemic, we also had certain state of emergency. It is not much difference from there, because the logic of assembly, the logic of rights of the individual, all these things are pretty much the same. I remember during the smallpox that happened in India, the bodies were treated with like as if they were going to destroy the entire population, and some people were willfully sacrificed so that they wouldn't contaminate further population. And this is stories that we have heard in lores from people, and it is accounted also. So it's not that the fault line only happens in the community; it happens at multiple levels, to the level of the nation state trying to other the other, to the level of the internal enemy that has to be kept isolated and subjugated. And it is very interesting because it happens at varied levels.
And that is playing out at the level of global geopolitics, isn't it? When you have large segments of the world itself being, marked for possible biological citizenship. And Shaura said he wants to return to that point at some. So over to you, Shaura, for biological citizenship. And I would suggest that you move biological citizenship towards the point where Arjun also was talking about genocide and eventually necropolitics, with which we can end. So over to you, Saurav, now.
So the first point that struck me about biological citizenship is simply the idea of how we define the population, right? I mean, the human being becomes numbers, the number of people affected, the number of people not affected. So these things start to take over. At some point, for example, in the pandemic, I remember we would only talk about the days would start with looking at news of how many people are getting, what is the percentage of people getting better, or other people dying. So this is an interesting changing of identities that happen. And secondly, and this is, I don't know, see, at some level, it's not also out of the ordinary, because probably this is how the state as an authority also essentially has to view its people. Because the state, because when we talk about census, or when we talk about any collective information gathering practices, for example, it is done through numbers, right? So we don't really see identities playing out, or personal personal relations work. So and then of course, the second part of what I thought I would talk about is that that how different practices like isolation, then hospitalization, right, and then vaccination, sterilization, all this become part of how they become a series of checks and balances, basically, to work this, right, to make this collective census kind of thing work. So the citizenship, therefore the biological citizenship can be only practiced if these checks and balances systems are in place. Otherwise, once again, if the population becomes human, as in like they become some people we know, then it becomes a problem for the state again. Because when we are looking at identities through as numbers, it's easier to divide them. And I mentioned this in my notes also, that states, marking like areas as red, yellow, green, or the idea that so and an obvious point here is that how successive levels of surveillance can be put in place through these individual practices also. But then that is the I think that is essentially the nature of any I think one point which Arjun talked about in the beginning was pastoral, and forget the full term, but something about how the population was kept in check by the church to maintain its safety, to maintain its general well-being kind of a thing. So it's at the end of the day, yeah, it is inevitable, I feel, and this is something that comes out only when times like these what happens. Otherwise, I think we live in this kind of very safe notion that okay, our identities are unique. But at the end of the day, we have become numbers when the time for in these things. Thanks.
Yeah, that's crucial also because of this tie-up between the state apparatus and the corporate apparatus, which we now increasingly worry about. For example, the pharmacological industry which prescribed dolo on a large scale, which became controversial. After the pandemic, we discovered what was going on, and the prescription drugs that are constantly pushed down our throats, literally, actually, which points to this nexus between the corporate and the state in the factor of biopolitics making the others, and which eventually, of course, is the production of life and the production of death, or as Mimbe and others would say, just letting people die. And we will move towards necropolitics now with Arjun's comments. Arjun?
Necropolitics has to do with the vulnerability and the recognition of vulnerability of individuals. So we agree to this premise from the get-go of this course that everybody is vulnerable. It is through the recognition or the acknowledgement of our shared vulnerability that we can coexist. But not everybody is helpless at the same time. And helplessness is distributed in varied ways across identity markers. Some people are more helpless than others. It's like Orwell says, all animals are equal, but not every animal is equal in the same way. All are equal, but not all animals are equal in the same way. So here it is like that. So some populations which are already at a disadvantage because of their identity are disposed of in this power nexus that happens between the state and the government. So we remember the tough choices the government had to make when they were trying to roll out healthcare to a lot of people. So there was, and this is one point we came across in the section on old age also. While the old people were considered giving vaccines in the first place, when it came to healthcare, when they were put on life support, they were not the first ones to be getting care. And this we remember seeing in Italy. They had to choose between, and it went to the identity marker of their age. So all people were not given oxygen cylinders, whereas young people who might prove useful to the society at a later point in time, they were given preference over all people. And these things happen. So this is a very clear indicator, and this has a clear connection to the notion of productivity in the capitalist society. But at the same time, there are other factors that also work. The factors which are much more subtler of class, of caste, of how the current regime treats a certain identity marker. Obviously, these people or these identity people who belong to this identity will also be preferred. So it's simply a choice of who should survive here and who should not. And it is also like, if you want to be a citizen, if you want to have the so and so freedom of traveling from a place to other, trying to engage in the economy, you have to adhere to these means. And here comes the question of agency. The loss of agency happens in two ways. It's because of the virus or the potential loss of the biological agency, like as a subject who can act, who do not need support from the healthcare. Also because of the political system that has aggravated your vulnerability, you lose your agency because you cannot avail the services. So if you do not have access to certain means of life support, vaccination, not everybody has access to vaccination the same way. People living in rural areas, people who are poorer, people who belong to certain identity markers, they do not have access in the same way to all these things. So if you do not go through this check and measure system, you will not qualify as a biological citizen. Then what happens is, it's not that the state is letting you die in obvious cases, like when you come to the hospital just because you are old, you are not given oxygen cylinders. It is also that just to be a working or functioning citizen, it becomes hard because you cannot avail these services owing to the nature of your identity. So the necropolitics is not as simple as we think in these cases. It is very wide. It also depends on the identity of the people, which gets aggravated due to the existing conditions of the hazard that is happening.
And which changes from regime to regime, context to context. So who is seen as quote unquote deserving of rights? Where people are arguing for healthcare as a fundamental right, and there is now talk of therapeutic citizenship as a matter of routine and right, where as you rightly pointed out, Arjun, necropolitics has multiple layers and it occurs in multiple forms, which is important. So as we have seen, we have marched quite a bit from our argument about biopolitical identities as surveillance to questions of, or through questions of welfareisms, which are also contingent upon identifying bodies, injurable bodies, degrees of injurability, and of course our own participation in the system. And that is where it becomes really tragically ironic, because on the one hand you have to participate, but on the other the means of participation are far more limited in terms of, say, geographical location. The other day I was teaching in class poetry from Jayanta Mahapatra and Robin Ngangom, and there's a statement where Ngangom says, I don't even want to meet the woman and her child who for the last several years, and it's 50 years of independent India, have not had rice for a meal on any day. So it's a nicely topological spatial arrangement, but the question is of something larger. It's of biopolitics, of letting people die. And what I meant when I said letting people die is structures that prevent your participation in those very structures. Identity markers, which Arjun has repeatedly emphasized, and the fact that by virtue of possessing an identity marker, you're automatically disqualified. So you are biological citizens precisely because your biology has been rejected. It's an inverted, perverse way of thinking about it too. That you have a biology, but it's a biology whose cultural markers have rendered it null and void, so to speak. I mean, bodies are bodies, but some bodies are not bodies because the overlaid cultural structures mean that you don't get past the structures to the bodies themselves. That has been a very beautiful and wonderful discussion. So thank you both, Shaurya and Arjun, for this longish journey in such short time through biopolitics. All right. Thank you so much. And I will send the videos after they are downloaded to you. Okay. Bye.